Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joey Sescon. I'm the host of the seminar, the episode of our seminar series. So before we start, I'll just have to uh, g- give some information and some reminders. Let me share my screen.
Recording in progress.
Okay. Sorry with that. Okay. Okay, I may not have to play it. So just to remind us, okay. So I'm having difficulties with my. Just to remind us, okay, of the house rules. We will let the speaker finish his presentation before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. And during the question and answer, you can raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. As participants on YouTube, please post your question in the comment sections. The slides and videos and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his or her consent for sharing them. Okay. Our speaker for today, our guest speaker for today is Dr. Fenella Carpena, who is an associate professor of economics at the Oslo Business School, Oslo Metropolitan University. She is an applied microeconomist with a particular interest in development economics. Prior to joining Oslo uh, Metropolitan University, she obtained her PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Um, the title of her presentation is The Impact of a Decline in Conflict on Food Security, Evidence from Colombia. I have some more information regarding our seminar series. You can visit our website uh, in ateneo.edu sus economics for more information on the previous seminars and oncoming seminars. And we have posted also the seminar videos that are made available by the guest speakers. And just to post in advance, we have our next episode on November 22, Wednesday. That will be the guest speaker is Dr. Daniel Del Barrio Alvarez, and the topic is on household preferences for renewable energy across ASEAN cities. Um, for some participants who wants to have a certificate, you can request form in this website, and some emails will not be entertained because it will be open for a limited time only. Certificates will only be given to those who attended via Zoom and who accomplished the request form. For those who successfully completed the request form, kindly wait for scheduled release for the certificate. And just to acknowledge that technical backup staff for our seminar series, our graduate assistant Rinier Mora and Aya Gulapa, and of course our tech support, Rudel Crisostomo. Okay. With this, I would like to welcome and give the floor to Dr. Fenella.
Great.
Dr. Fenella.
So let me share my screen. Let's see. Let me make it full screen.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk. And I'd also like to thank the organizers and the whole department for inviting me to present a work in progress paper. So this paper is one that I got involved in through research funding that we received from the Research Council of Norway under the Segura project from the Research Council's NOR Global 2 program. So the topic of today's talk is basically about the impact of a decline in conflict on food insecurity, looking at this question, particularly in the context of Colombia. So the main motivation for this project is that while there is a long tradition linking conflict and food security, there's still a gap in this literature. So there's one strand of literature that basically looks at the direction of the impact of conflict on food security. And there's this large literature that shows that having conflict has a negative effect on the food security of households. So for instance, food systems get disrupted, crops and livestock get destroyed, and people lose their assets and income. And as a result of that, households experience malnutrition, which has then lasting impacts on the development. At the same time, there's also a strand in the literature that looks at it in the opposite direction, which basically looks at, the impact of food insecurity on conflict. And basically, this literature also shows that when people are food insecure, that leads to unrest and civil strife. So for instance, you can think of situations where food prices have been high, which then led to food riots and more violence. So in this literature, there's actually, even though there's this large literature that looks at the relationship between conflict and food insecurity in both directions, the role of peace has been relatively underexplored. And this is something that is a gap in literature, and it has also been pointed out by international organizations like the FAO. And so in this paper, I'm going to look at the impact of the decline in conflict on food security of households. I'm going to look at this question, as I mentioned, in the context of Colombia, where basically the largest rebel group in Colombia, called the Revolutionary Armed Forces, or FARC, declared a ceasefire in 2014, which meant that they withdrew all their forces and basically stopped all of their offensive activities. And at the same time, also in 2016, there was a peace agreement between FARC and the government. So the conflict in Colombia is one that has been a long-running conflict. It lasted half a century, and more than 200,000 people have died as a result of this conflict. So in this project, my question is basically to try to understand what are the impacts of this decline in conflict on food insecurity. And I'm going to think of food insecurity in several ways. One is food insecurity of kind of the food insecurity experience of the entire household. And then within the household, I'm also going to break that down into the food insecurity experience of adults of the household, as well as children in the household. So that kind of conceptualization of food insecurity is coming from the Latin American and Caribbean Food Security Scale, or the ELCSA, from its Spanish name, where basically in this food security scale, we conceptualize food insecurity as having different dimensions. So that, for instance, when they're food insecure, people start feeling anxiety or feeling uncertain about whether they will have access to food in the future. And then when people experience shocks, negative shocks, they kind of first cope with that shock by compromising on the quality of their diet. So for instance, decreasing the food and vegetables that they're eating and maybe eating more potatoes or starch. A more severe form of food insecurity is evident when people decrease the amount of food that they're eating. So that's in terms of diet quantity. And then kind of the most extreme form of food insecurity and when people feel hunger. We're going to look at kind of all of these dimensions, both within adults in the household and then children in the household separately. My identification strategy is going to basically come from a very simple difference in differences design, where I'm going to compare treated and controlled municipalities over time. Treated municipalities are going to be those municipalities that had high exposure to FARC violence at baseline, so before my data starts. And basically, you can think of the treatment in this context as basically kind of getting peace, so quote unquote peace. So the treatment group are basically municipalities that got peace after the ceasefire in 2014 and the peace agreement, whereas the control municipalities are municipalities that basically had no change in their conflict experience because they always had peace, quote unquote. So there is a large literature or a growing literature now that looks at the impact of conflict in Colombia and the impact in particular of the ceasefire and the peace agreement. So for instance, there's a paper by Prem et al. That looks at effects on school attainment and test scores and find that basically after when the ceasefire happened, students, there was less dropout and students were more likely to attend school. There's also impacts on fertility that basically after the ceasefire, households were more optimistic about the future and then fertility increased. There's also papers on entrepreneurship dynamics and credit. And in this set of growing literature, I'm kind of trying to look at a different set of outcomes, which is basically food insecurity. So just to give a preview of the results, what I find is that basically, perhaps unsurprisingly, the decline in conflict is associated with less food insecurity. These improvements are evident in all aspects of food insecurity that I talked about. So for instance, there are gains in diet, the quality of the diet, the quantity of diet, and also as well in hunger. So I see a 31% drop in the proportion of households reporting that they stopped having, any household member stopped having a healthy diet. I also see a 19% drop in the proportion of households saying that they ran out of food, and a 38% drop in the proportion of households that say that any household member had eaten only once or didn't eat the whole day in the last 30 days. Kind of more interestingly, the more interesting kind of part, I think, is to kind of look at how these gains are distributed between adults and children in the household. And basically what I see is that the improvements in food security are larger for the children in the household. And so, for instance, there's a 40% decline in the proportion of households saying that children in the household stopped having a healthy diet. And there's a 50% decline in the proportion of households saying that children in the household ate less than usual. And then a large 71% drop in the proportion of households saying that the children in the household experience hunger. So if I look at these same kind of outcomes among adults in the household, I see that it improved also, but to much lesser extent. So for instance, there's a 24% drop in households saying that the adults in the household ate less than usual, which is half the size of what we observed for children, because for children, the drop was 50%. And there is also a large drop in hunger among adults. So there's a drop of 50% of households reporting that adults in the household experience hunger. And that even though that 50% drop is large, that is still also smaller than what children experience in the household, which is that 71% drop. So an important question to ask is kind of what are the potential mechanisms for why we see these effects? And I'll show you later that kind of this, I have suggestive evidence which indicates that perhaps it's an increase in income and increase in economic opportunities, and also households having more income and feeling less poor, and also stability, which probably makes households more likely to kind of invest in their children as well. And all of these results are consistent with previous food security literature and also studies of the ceasefire and peace agreement in Colombia. So let me start by giving just kind of a brief overview of the conflict. So the conflict actually began in the 1960s, and it began because of the launch of two Marxist guerrilla groups. So the biggest one is the Revolutionary Armed Forces, or FARC, and the National Liberation Army, ELN. And these groups basically, when they were launched, their stated goal was basically to overthrow the government, and they claimed to represent the rural poor. The conflict continued on after that, but it was mostly a low-intensity conflict, and in the 1980s, it was primarily thought to be a proxy for the Cold War. The conflict escalated in the 1990s, in part because of the emergence of organized paramilitary groups, such as the United Self-Defense Groups of Colombia. During this period in the 1990s, FARC, which is the largest rebel group, also got involved in cultivation of coca, which is the crop that is used to produce cocaine. So this involvement by FARC in the drug trade allowed them to increase their presence throughout the country, and they allowed them to expand their presence, especially in the south and the east part of the country. In the 1990s, the group FARC experienced a series of military successes. Because of these military successes, the president at that time of Colombia, President Andrés Pastrana, engaged in peace talks with them, but it ultimately failed. In 2002 to 2010, that was the term of President Álvaro Uribe, and he was elected and re-elected with a mandate to fight the guerrillas. And so during this period, starting in 2002, there was actually, this is where kind of the conflict reached its peak. After Uribe's term, President Juan Manuel Santos was elected, and he began a new round of peace talks with FARC, and he would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for these peace talks. So those peace talks started in October 2012, and these were the first peace talk, I think, was hosted by Norway, and it was also subsequently hosted by Cuba. So for my purposes, kind of like the main dates of interest are kind of when kind of had been a decline in conflict. And that began when FARC declared a unilateral ceasefire in December 2014. And what that meant was that FARC withdrew their troops to more remote areas, and their offensive activities fell by almost 98%. So this is kind of one kind of date when violence began to decline. In 2016, violence declined further because of the peace agreement. So the peace negotiations were completed in 2016 and was submitted for electoral approval. It was initially rejected by voters by a very small margin. The voters who rejected the peace agreement were basically viewed the agreement to be too lenient to FARC and giving them too many concessions. So the agreement was adjusted to incorporate these concerns, and then the final peace agreement was basically approved by Congress in November 2016. So again, for my purpose, I'm kind of interested in kind of when violence started to decline. So what I will see in the data, and I will show you later, is that violence started to decline in 2014 and 2015 as a result of the ceasefire, and then violence further declined and was basically further cemented. The decline of violence was further cemented after the peace agreements happened in 2016. So let me talk a bit about the data and the variables. So I'm going to use for my outcome variables, I'm going to use household data from the National Quality of Life Survey, which is the Encuesta Nacional de Calidad de Vida, or ENCV. So this is a household survey that is collected by the National Statistics Agency of Colombia since 1993 as repeated cross-sections. So even though these data have been collected since 1993, in this study that I'm doing, I'm only going to use 3 waves of the survey. In particular, I'm going to use waves 2008, 2012, and 2017. And the reason why I focus on these waves is because these are the waves of the survey that have measures of food insecurity. So basically my pre-treatment years are going to be 2008 and 2012, and my post-treatment year is basically 2017. The data identifies households up to the municipality level, and across all of these 3 waves, there's 187 municipalities that are covered in the data. The main outcome variable that I'm going to look at, as I mentioned, is food insecurity based on the Latin American and Caribbean Food Security Scale. So this food security scale is based on self-reports. So people are self-reporting their own experience of food security. So that's different from other measures of food security, such as measuring people's height and weight. So kind of the advantage of kind of relying on self-reports is that it's much easier to implement and much less costly to implement. So for instance, collecting height and weight of household members is something that is quite costly. But at the same time, these measures have been validated in Colombia and other countries in the region. So there are a group of nutritionists and other social scientists that have made sure that these measures are valid that they actually capture food insecurity. And the food security scale is based on capturing different domains of food insecurity based on earlier theories by Radimer et al. In the US on kind of how people cope with food insecurity. So let me talk about the scale a little bit. So basically in the questionnaire, in the data, it asks, in the last 30 days, due to lack of money or other resources, did any member of the household or did any adult of the household or child of the household ever, stop having a healthy or nutritious diet, have a limited variety in diet? So these 2 questions are capturing the quality of the diet. They also ask if these people in the household eat less than usual or run out of food, which is a measure of diet quantity. And then they also ask if these people in the household ever felt hungry or didn't eat the whole day, which are measures of hunger. So they ask these questions about the entire household, which is then broken down, which they then later ask specifically about adults in the household and then specifically for children in the household. So a couple of things to point out about this measure. So the first is that the question specifically asks due to lack of money or other resources. So that kind of ensures that people's choices in terms of their food intake are due to lack of money and other resources, rather than, for instance, religious fasting or other types of reasons. The second thing is that the questionnaire captures kind of these different concepts, diet quality, quantity, and hunger, based on kind of a theorized way of how people cope with food insecurity. So the theory is that when people experience shocks, they first, a mild form of insecurity is when people feel uncertain regarding their ability to obtain food. And kind of a more severe form of that is when people compromise on food quality and variety. So kind of the idea is that when people get negative shocks, they first kind of cope with that shock by eating less fruits and vegetables, for instance, which are typically more expensive, and eating like cheaper sources of food like starchy foods. So a more severe form of that is when people actually reduce the amount of food that they eat. And then the most extreme form is when they actually experience hunger. The theory also kind of conceptualizes that there are differences between adults and children, which is that essentially when a household faces a shock, the household kind of shields the children from experiencing hunger. And so when adults in the household experience food insecurity, that's kind of a mild form of insecurity. But when children in the household are the ones experiencing food insecurity, that's a severe form of food insecurity. We kind of think of the household as kind of trying to protect the children. And it's like really in the most dire cases when children are feeling hungry. So I matched these household data with conflict data from the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica. So this is a government agency in Colombia which is tasked with preserving all documentary evidence about the conflict there. And they provide an event level data which covers the entire conflict period. So for each conflict event, they say what kind of conflict it was, what kind of event it was, where it occurred, the municipality where it occurred, who was involved, so I can see whether those events were involving FARC or other groups, and when it occurred, and also the number of victims. So the types of conflict covered in data are basically quite expansive. So it covers not just acts of war, explosion of mines, or damage to civil property, but also things like assassinations, massacres, and sexual violence. So for my purposes, I'm basically interested in kind of aggregating this data up to the municipality level so I can match them to the household level data. So basically count the number of FARC-related incidents across all conflict types in each municipality and year. And I'm going to use that information to define my municipalities as treatment and control. So I'm going to define a treatment municipality as basically a municipality that had high exposure to FARC at baseline. So a treatment municipality is one that had high exposure to FARC at baseline. What does that mean? I'm going to define highly exposed to FARC as basically municipalities that are in the top quartile of the total number of FARC conflict events in the baseline period, which I'm considering as 1993 to 2007, normalized by the number of inhabitants in 1993 in that municipality. So this kind of definition of defining a municipality that is highly exposed to FARC, I'm following previous literature here, similar to a paper by Ateneo et al. In 2013. And out of all of the 187 municipalities that are in my sample, I basically take the top quartile of this measure. So just to kind of illustrate what this variable looks like, in the 10th percentile, it's 0.4. In the 75th percentile, it's 12.22. In the 90th percentile, it's 35.87. So I take basically municipalities that are in the top 25th percentile as treatment municipalities. So basically that means that municipalities that had at least 12.22 FARC-related conflict events per 10,000 people during the period 1993 to 2000, those are my municipalities that are treatment municipalities. So here's a picture to kind of describe that basically kind of my categorization of treatment and control municipalities makes sense. So in this figure, I'm plotting years in 2008 to 2021. And the y-axis is basically the average number of FARC-related events normalized by the population and plotted separately for treatment and control municipalities. So as I said, kind of we can think of the treatment municipalities, the treatment or the intervention in this project as basically getting peace, whereas control municipalities basically didn't get the intervention because they always had peace. And so that's kind of exactly what we can see here. So treatment municipalities experienced a sharp drop in FARC-related violence in 2014 and 15, which is basically kind of after the ceasefire. And then that was further solidified in 2016 when the peace agreement was signed. In contrast, the control municipalities, which are the blue line, basically had relatively no stark changes in their conflict experience because it's very close to zero during the entire period. So as I mentioned, my empirical strategy is kind of a basic difference in difference where I have 3 waves of data, 2008, 2012, and 2017. So my pre-period is going to be 2008 and 2012, and my post-period is 2017 wave of the survey. And as I said, the treatment group are those households in municipalities that had high exposure to FARC violence at baseline. My empirical specification is very straightforward. So I'm going to regress outcomes Y of household I in survey wave T on municipality fixed effects, which captures fixed differences in municipalities. I'm going to have time trends, which are district by year, department by year, where departments are kind of larger administrative units than municipalities. So I'm controlling for time trends that are common to all municipalities in the same department over time. I have the interaction of the treatment and the post dummy. So beta gives us the difference in difference estimate. And then I have some household controls, such as the size of the household, the age of the household head, and the gender of the household head. The standard errors in this regression are clustered at the municipality level. And I have 2 important points about kind of who is the sample that I'm using for estimating this regression. So the first is that I'm restricting the sample to only those households that have lived in the same municipality since 1993. And the reason for that is because I define treatment municipalities as those that had high exposure to FARC violence between 1993 and 2007. And during the conflict in Colombia, there has been a lot of displacement. So households have been moving around, and there's been a lot of forced displacement, actually. And so I need to restrict households to be living in the same municipality so that I'm matching them kind of with their right FARC conflict exposure. The second kind of restriction is that I'm only looking at urban households for this sample. The reason is because in the 2017 wave in the data, the 2017 data is only available for urban households. And so to ensure that it's comparable to the previous years, I'm also using only urban households in the previous years. So the outcomes are going to be dummies for the food insecurity experience of any household member, so the entire household, the food insecurity experience of children in the household, and the food insecurity experience of adults in the household. So since I only have 3 waves of the data that I'm using, it's very difficult to kind of estimate event study models to look at parallel trends. So I'm just going to look at that using the raw data, which I've plotted here. So here, what I've plotted is the x-axis is basically the year, the survey wave, of which I have 3. And the y-axis is the proportion of households that say yes to this question. So what we can see here is that, for instance, for the question, in the last 30 days, did any household member stop having a healthy or nutritious diet? We can see that in the 2008 survey wave, there's a big gap between treatment municipalities, which are the blue line, and control municipalities, which are the yellow-orange line. So that gap is around 10 percentage points. So basically, control municipalities have worse food security, have more food insecurity than control municipalities. So we can see that the gap was 10 percentage points, and that gap is actually stayed constant in 2012. But then after the ceasefire and the peace agreement, that basically has narrowed. And then we also see that the same outcome for running out of food. There's a gap between the treatment control households in treatment control municipalities, which stays the same in 2012, which has narrowed a bit after the ceasefire and peace agreement. We can also see the same for outcomes related to hunger. So the proportion of households that felt hungry but didn't eat were basically, there's a 10 percentage point gap between treatment and control in 2008, which then stays the same similarly in 2012 and has narrowed in 2017. And similarly for this other measure of hunger, which is eating only once or didn't eat the whole day. So we can estimate also these effects that I showed in the picture using difference in difference specification that I showed earlier. So what we can see here is that households have better food security across all domains in diet quality, diet quantity, and hunger. So for instance, there's a 12 percentage point drop in households saying that they stopped having a healthy or nutritious diet, and a 5 percentage point drop in households saying that they ran out of food. The largest effects are actually in hunger. So there's like a 7.2 percentage point drop in the proportion of households saying that they ate only once or didn't eat the whole day. So that's around like a third of the baseline average, which was the pre-treatment average, which was around 19 percentage points of households. So then I can look it's interesting to look at these differences between children and adults in the household. So I basically look at the same outcome variables separately for children and adults in the household. So on the left panel, what I can see here is on the left column, these outcomes refer to food insecurity of children in the household. And then on the right column, these are outcomes for adults in the household. And the top row is basically for whether there was any child or adult in the household that ate less than usual. And in the bottom is whether there was any child or adult in the household that felt hungry but didn't eat. So kind of a key point that we can see here is that, again, there's a gap between treatment-controlled households in treatment and control municipalities before the ceasefire and the peace agreement. So the ceasefire was in 2014 and the peace agreement was in 2016. And that gap basically kind of is almost close to zero for children after the ceasefire and peace agreement. For the same outcome variable, which is eating less than usual, the gap has narrowed for adults, but to a much lesser extent. And we see kind of the same pattern for the outcome variable related to hunger, which is whether there was any child in the household that felt hungry but didn't eat, and whether there was any adult that felt hungry but didn't eat in the last 30 days. So kind of what we can see here in the picture, which I think is really interesting, is that the improvements in food insecurity are basically much larger for children than the adults in the household. So the adults in the household also experienced improved food security, but to a much lesser extent than children, where for children, basically the gap has almost diminished to very close to zero. So we can see these estimates in the difference in difference model that I described earlier. So in panel A, it's looking at questions about the food security and experience of children, and panel B is for adults. So in column 1, the question of whether children stopped having a healthy or nutritious diet shows that there's a 13 percentage point drop of households reporting that children in the household stopped having a healthy or nutritious diet. So we can't compare that to adults because that question wasn't asked in the survey. But we can see, for instance, that for diet quantity, the effects for children are larger both in absolute terms and in percentage terms. So for instance, for children, there's like a 13 percentage point drop in children and households saying that children in the household ate less than usual or had less food. That's around 50% change from their baseline values, which are 0.26% and 25%. Whereas for adults, we still see that there is an improvement as well. So there's like a 4 to 8% change for adults in the household, but that's a smaller change compared to their pre-treatment average. Again, kind of the larger effects, both for children and adults, are in terms of hunger, where there's basically like a 7 to 10 percentage point drop in hunger measures for children in the household, and around a 7 to 8 percentage point for adults. But again, in percentage terms, it's much larger for children. So at baseline, for instance, 10% of households say that children in the household ate only once or didn't eat the whole day. And for that question, we see a 7 percentage point drop, and which basically means that it percentage-wise, it changed by almost 70 or 80%, whereas for adults, it went down by only 50%, from 16 percentage points for a proportion of 16 to basically 8. So now in the remaining time, I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of what are the potential mechanisms for why we see these effects. And I'm going to look at these questions in the context of the 4 pillars of food security, where basically what is food security as defined by the FAO. So the FAO defines food security as a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this definition is a standard one from the FAO, which came from the World Food Security Summit in the 1990s. And this definition basically gives rise to 4 dimensions of food security, which are basically food availability. So whether people have sufficient quantities of food, and that's coming from crop production, food aid, etc. So whether there's enough food to go around to begin with. The second pillar is basically measures of access to food. So basically whether people have resources for acquiring food. So that is, for instance, things like income and subsidies, prices, etc. Food utilization captures the non-food inputs to food security, such as clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. And then there's food stability, which holds that households should have adequate access to food at all times. So I basically look at kind of these 4 pillars and see whether any of them might be the potential mechanisms for why we're seeing these changes in food security. So I first look at crop production, municipality level crop production during the same years as my household data. So what we can see here is that the outcome variable here is log crop production. So the point estimates are percentage changes. So we can see that there's a 48% change in production, decline in the production of maize, and a 43% increase in the production of beans. And there's positive effects also on production of cassava, plantains, and coffee, although they're not significant. So these are just kind of suggestive evidence that production may have moved towards longer term crops. So maize is a short-term crop, whereas cassava and plantain are perennial plants. So it could be that households or food production is moving towards longer-term crops. And also there's an increase in production of things like coffee, which suggests that food production may also be moving towards cash crops, which has an implication on households' income. So I look at kind of food access and income in more detail using questions from the survey. So there's questions in the survey about whether households feel that they don't have enough income to meet their expenses and whether they consider themselves poor. And also a variable capturing the monthly income of the household. So what we can see here is that there is an improvement in terms of how households see themselves. So there's a positive increase in monthly income, but it's not statistically significant. But there's a statistically significant decline in households saying that they don't have enough income to cover their expenses and they think they're poor. One kind of question that I've always get asked is, one potential reason why there's been kind of an increase in food insecurity for children rather than adults is that there might be kind of subsidies that are going towards children. So what I can see in the data is there's kind of no change in whether households receive any type of subsidy. So the point estimate is very close to 0. And in terms of kind of other social services, there's also no change in kind of how whether households have health insurance. And then I look at the last 2 pillars, which are about food utilization and food stability. So food utilization refers to kind of non-food inputs to food security, such as clean water and sanitation, and how households prepare food. So I don't see any effect on kind of the ways that households are changing their food preparation practices. So for instance, there's no change in whether households are using pipe water to prepare food or whether they have kind of a separate room in their house for cooking. And there's also kind of no statistically significant effect on whether households have sanitation in their house as defined by having a connected or unconnected toilet. There is kind of a large decline in kind of whether households say that they ever worried that food would run out in the last 30 days, which kind of suggests that food is more stable. So there's more stability that allows households to be less anxious or feel less uncertain about whether they will have access to food in the future. And so this kind of suggests that food access has become more stable, and probably kind of this kind of stability is also kind of contributing to how households are kind of investing more in their children, for example. So I'm basically kind of out of time. I think I've used up my 40 minutes. So just kind of a few points. So in this paper, I've used difference and differences to study the effect of the decline in conflict on food security of households in Colombia. And what I find is that the decline in conflict is associated with less food insecurity. But interestingly, the gains from food security are larger among children in the household than adults in the household. It's kind of interesting to think about why these effects are present. And it seems like households are less food insecure because of higher income and kind of more stability. And this is quite something that I'm still working on. And there's no paper yet, mainly slides. So I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments that you have, and also kind of suggestions for other things that I might explore or consider to study. Thanks for your attention. And thanks again to the organizers for having me in the seminar series this semester.
Thank you, Dr. Carpena, for that very interesting presentation of conflict and food security. Now we go to our question and answer portion. And may I ask if may I see the audience if they have some questions? Kindly raise your hand. Okay, yeah, I cannot see really them, but just to start, because that's my rule also here. um, um, I've seen that. Can you actually say also that children children looks like they gain a lot because of the peace after so much conflict? But can we extend the kind of observation, probably conclusion, that children are really affected most, both by during conflict and both as well as peace? They are the most affected in both situations.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. What I see actually is that in the pre-treatment period, so during the conflict and before kind of peace came, children actually had better food security outcomes than adults. And they also had better health outcomes than adults. So basically, kind of, at least in the data, I see that children are less affected by, if you take that as a measure of kind of whether children are more affected, that kind of indicates that children are less affected than adults, like during the conflict, which is kind of consistent with kind of how we, or at least kind of when we think of food insecurity, or at least how food security has been theorized kind of in the social sciences literature, which is that when there's a negative shock, such as conflict, kind of households typically try to shield the children from these shocks. And so as a result of that, children kind of are less affected by it than adults. So that's kind of what I see in the data. But it is the case that conflict has larger kind of, the experience of conflict has longer term consequences for children. So for instance, like especially there's been papers that have shown that basically, malnutrition at a very young age, for instance, due to conflict, has a lot of long run consequences on health outcomes as adults. So in that way, children also are, if children are not protected in a way shielded from the impacts of the conflict, then they will suffer kind of more consequences from it in the future. But these are very important points to think about for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. So unless there are more questions, I have, Maha, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Fenella, for that very interesting presentation. This may be a naive question. I'm not sure about what's the situation in Colombia, but I was just wondering if there were any food aid, like international food aid, that may have help in food security when there was a conflict and then after the conflict, and what might those food aid would that food aid play the role in the food insecurity or food security in the country?
Yes, no, this is a really important question. And thanks for that question and also for organizing the seminar and inviting me to speak today. So the role of food aid is also very important for sure. In the data, I don't have measures of whether the data doesn't give me measures of whether amount of food aid that has been coming in. The only thing that I see in the data is whether children in the household are receiving programs, for instance, like free lunch at school or things like that. And I don't see any change in that outcome variable. And so that's actually consistent with the fact that even though the conflict in Colombia has been something that is very long running and has affected many people's lives, it has been a low intensity conflict over the entire conflict period. Which means that some parts of kind of regular life, especially in urban areas, can still function in a way. And so even though I can't account for food aid directly because of lack of data, I don't see any impacts. I don't see any changes over time between treatment and control in terms of, children receiving food programs in school, for instance. Thank you. I should try to kind of address that more, both in the future paper and in the presentation. Food aid.
Any other questions? I think until there's another question, I have a follow-up question, Dr. Carpena. Just really wondering or kind of technical. When you mentioned about income and because it's a difference in difference, the income is actually, even if you have an increase in income or a lower income for both groups, because that both group captures in the average, whether there's an increase in income or then that should not matter. The difference is the gap is the one that shows the gap of the reduction in the gap of less food security already is enough to say that income doesn't really matter. Food security is less when there's more income, right? If households have more income, they can manage.
There'll be more food secure, right?
Yeah, they're more food secure. So that for an audience listening to the study, what about income? Can you say so you have a slide also on there might be actually an increase in income because of stability. But I was also wondering because of the difference in difference, you have actually averaged out whatever is the increase in income. So I would rather go into the gap analysis.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So I guess in the difference, I think in the difference in difference, I'm kind of differencing out changes in income that are common across all municipalities within the same region, since that's captured by the time trend. And I'm also kind of differencing out average differences in income across households in municipalities so that's kind of like captured. So some municipalities are kind of just generally richer than other municipalities. And so that's also kind of difference out using the municipality fixed effect. So the kind of difference that isn't difference out in the difference in difference is the changes in income over time that are different between treatment and control municipalities. And so you can imagine that, for instance, so it actually has been documented in other papers in this literature that in these municipalities that have experienced like larger, more conflict in the past, there has been kind of more economic opportunities after the ceasefire and the peace agreement. Part of that could be kind of people rebuilding efforts, for instance. So there's kind of also this large literature just in general that there's economic growth. Kind of, you can think of it as kind of like rebuilding after large negative shocks. So that kind of leads to kind of more growth because there's, you know, government spending to build more infrastructure, etc. And that's kind of creating economic opportunities. So that seems to be kind of, I do see kind of some effect on on basically treated households saying that they feel less poor. There's a differential trend in terms of how households say that they are feeling less poor between treatment control municipalities, where there's a larger the drop there for treatment municipalities. But yes, so income is kind of something that can be affected by peace also, right? So that's kind of an outcome variable that I look at. So for that reason, it's an outcome variable that I look at as well.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I cannot see a raised hand. Don't be shy. Ask your questions.
That's good. That means everything was clear also.
I'm from Mindanao, as you know, so I really am interested with that topic, given conflict areas, and the complexity with the coca plantation as well.
Yes,
In the case of
yes.
Colombia, but in the case of Mindanao, there are also complications with other what we call sometimes here kind of euphemism is the shadow economy of Mindanao.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so there's in conflict areas or in the trade of Sulu, there are different kinds of, but it's you know, in the case of Mindanao, these people who are engaged on those now we can probably term them as illegal, are really separate from from uh, from the arm groups. They're not connected. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the one who's doing trade. I don't know in Colombia. Just wondering if I think there are, as you in one of your slides, you said that the rebel groups are actually the FARC also engaged in connected to coca.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. So
similar to Afghanistan in some sense.
so I think they took away a lot of land from people, displaced, forcibly displaced people to take their land so that they could they could plant coca. So it's been, and they've used kind of financing the money that they've earned from coca cultivation to expand their presence, so that allowed them to expand further. So I'm very curious to kind of actually think about kind of, you know, what is the food security situation now also kind of in areas like in Mindanao, especially in kind of areas where there were a lot of, so I guess there hasn't been, conflict has declined in kind of in some areas,
Yeah,
but not
there are
others.
some.
But I guess we also don't have good data on there's not a lot of data on kind of household
Yeah,
level
that
data
could be a
on
problem.
households. Yeah,
Especially in the conflict areas in Mindanao, you could probably don't have that kind of data that you've got. So
yeah, but that would
yeah,
be really interesting to look at actually. Are there any data sources that are collected kind of
there's a regular national demographic health survey, the
right,
NDHS. Yeah, and
right.
we can look at it. I think there's and then the Food and Nutrition Research Institute. There's but that's not really regular. I don't think. I think it's every 5 years they conduct a nutrition survey,
I
country.
see. I
So
see.
there's a country nutrition survey every 5 years, and I think there are. I know I've studied one. Familiar with the questions on food security. They ask food security problems. I'm
I
not.
see.
I don't remember about the NDHS, but yes.
Yeah,
Uh,
DHS doesn't actually have so many food security questions because they're more like a health survey. So it's measuring a lot of health outcomes. They do have kind of weight and height
yeah.
which is kind of a measure of malnutrition in a
Yeah.
way.
Sorry
I
to
think
cut, but I think it's already
yes,
4:59. So
exactly, yeah.
it's
But it's
5
very
o'clock.
interesting,
So,
yeah.
and thank you very much, Dr. Fenela Carpena, for giving us your, uh, sharing with us your study. For now, before we end, I would like to share some of information. So the next episode we have, we should take a picture before I end
Oh yeah.
this one. Yeah. So please don't leave first. But I'm just saying that there will be another episode on November 22 with Dr. Daniel Del Barrio Alvarez of the University of Tokyo on household preferences for renewable energy across ASEAN cities. And for those who are interested to get their certificate, these are the information you should have. Okay, and last, of course, we thank our backup on this seminar. So with that, we should take a picture. Aya?
Yes, so
Okay,
I
so
encourage everyone to please turn on their videos. Okay, so I will be taking the photos in 1, 2, 3. One more, 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, thank you very much.
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanella. Thanks,
Thank
Joey.
you.